Hi, welcome to Learning from Caregivers, a new interview series where we'll be digging into the latest information from both caregivers and caregiving scientists to help people support the needs of older adults in their families and communities. This is a podcast for health professionals and for all of us who care for older adults. My name is Joan Monin, and I'm an associate professor at Yale School of Public Health. This is our first interview, and I can't think of a better person to kick off this series than Nancy May, CEO advisor, Eldercare specialist, host of the podcast Eldercare Success, and founder of Caremanity LLC. Nancy knows about the challenges that can drag us down emotionally, physically, and financially while caring for a loved one, but also how to stay resilient. And Nancy is the author of How to Survive 911 Medical Emergencies Step by Step Before, During, After, a topic that doesn't get enough attention but is crucial to the well being of caregivers and the people they care for. Thanks so much for being our guest, Nancy.
Thank you, Joan. It is such an honor to be here with you and to be was it numero uno one?
Yeah, you're the perfect person because you just have that on the ground experience. And I really wanted to get all of your vast knowledge of the practical aspects of caregiving and just what you've witnessed and heard about like all these years doing the work that you've been doing. And I really wanted you to kind of tell us your story about how you got started in this and give us some words of wisdom and really focus on the aspect of emergency too, which I
Right.
don't think has a lot of, attention. So Nancy, I wanted to start with, like, how Caremanity got started for you.
Well, it had a few twists and turns like every entrepreneurial start happens, but I was working and still work to some extent in public company boardrooms with large corporate CEOs and directors and those who want to get on their first public company board, which I also advise. But in the course of running that business, my parents started to become more frail. And I somewhat tongue in cheek say my folks prepared me for their death since I've been 5 because as the oldest child of my parents, I was the one who was always taught to what would happen if, and prepared to be their POA if need be. And every visit down from Connecticut to Florida where they lived, and I lived up in Connecticut, it was, here's where the equipment is, here's where the bank accounts are, the visit to the local attorney or the financial advisor or everybody else, that friends and family that were down here that would be part of the community of taking care of mom and dad. And they wanted to go into a care facility not to be a burden to my sister and myself, which I highly appreciate. But my parents were not a burden. Yet I still understand how many of our parents want to live independently. But after they moved in, mom had early stage signs of dementia. The cost of their care went from about $3,500 a month to a little over $30,000 a month very quickly. And they had saved well, but not to the tune of $360,000 a year. That's a lot of money. And so as their not only their medical fiduciary, but their financial fiduciary, I sat dad down, who did not have dementia, and say, "Dad, I got to be honest with you. This is what's going on, and you're a team player here. You're the beneficiary. That's great, but I want you to continue to be a beneficiary because I don't have an extra $30,000 just laying around in my bank account." And he panicked, and said, "Can we leave today?" And I said, "No, I have some plans and ideas, but you gotta let me work it out." So that was the beginning of what I call Mom and Dad Inc., running their quality care and their love and life together so that they were able to be happy together until those final moments, or I say the last breath. But I was able to save them, close to $250,000 a year in care and still have amazing quality of life for them and great care, and ran a team of 6, sometimes 8 aides as a small business, really, from Connecticut while they were down in Florida. So, that's why I say it's the business of Mom and Dad Inc. but I ran a business, so I knew how to do that, and I was prepared for it. Early, like I said, since 5, and maybe not financially part at 5, but certainly know how to call 911 at the age of 5, hence the book. Really.
So, what are some of the most important things you've learned over the years, um, leading your caregiving support group and also your podcast that's associated with that company?
I would say the first one of the first things is that so few of us are prepared for what to expect at this point in time. I think we talk about it, we've heard about it, we've seen others go through this, but when it comes to our own experience, it can be physically and emotionally draining. And especially if we're in a job and employed by somebody else, we're not prepared for the time off or the mental distraction that happens over the course of our working lives as well. And yes, companies may have benefits, but they're, I call it the finger in the dike mode. They're, here's a caseworker who may not understand your situation, who doesn't have the time to listen, who's just there to sell something to you to move on, versus having the people who are going to listen and really understand the whole picture of what's going on. And that's hard. Um, and building trust. So you have to really learn to understand your gut and be prepared for different stages of decline, which is hard.
Yeah, so you've, been the interviewer on lots of podcasts and on Eldercare Success. Are there any ones that you've done that really stood out to you, thinking, "Wow,
Yeah,
that really changed my view"?
yeah, well, definitely. The one of the earlier ones was with an attorney, and how many times when we give over our loved ones to a care facility or they go into a care facility, we trust those groups to oversee the quality care of our parents like we would. They're not a replacement for us. And sometimes things happen that we don't expect, or they're not getting the type of nurturing that we would give, and it turns into a disaster. And we automatically start thinking, sue, sue, sue. Somebody's wrong. What's going to happen? The ability for us to actually have control over that situation is pretty slim to none. And it's in the eyes of the court that really things change. And I'm not trying to say that we should be litigious about it. And there are some great facilities out there who do a good job. But it opened my eyes even more, which I already knew, to the amount of due diligence that we need to do in really understanding how contracts work, what that means, what questions we need to ask that aren't ever answered because we don't ask them, and how the business of elder care, I'll put in quotes, is sold to us. It's a very emotional process, and we trust too much. We really do.
So when you're going and figuring out, for yourself with your mom and dad when you were trying to find, elder care support, what were some things that you found to be helpful in that process or any kind of lessons you learned from that experience?
Great question. So, we first started out with an aid agency, which was required by the care facility that mom and dad was in, and the quality of the aids were pretty, nominal at best. I had the biker chick, I had the airhead, I had the, Stephanie, the girl that we had to counsel because she had lost her grandmother, and every time she saw my mom, she cried. And the list went on, and I felt bad for these, and they were young women, predominantly young and middle age. There were a couple who were exceptional, but when we fired the agency, when we moved, it was because the consistent quality of care was just not there. So what I learned was to understand that although somebody may have been doing this in the past, it doesn't mean that they're good for your parents. So my approach was to hire for attitude and train for competency. If they had some experience in showing care and affection and an emotional engagement with my parents and talk to them like they were their own, then I was fine. And we had some that came in and said, "So who are they? And what should I do with them?" Pointing versus others who would walk up and say, "Can I say hello to Audrey?" And they would walk up and say hello and start a conversation and ask questions and engage like there was nothing wrong with her from a cognitive capacity, and would listen to my dad's stories with interest and compassion. If you've
Yeah,
got the
that's so
attitude and compassion,
interesting.
you can train for the rest of it. It's not it I not to say not to downplay it, but it's not rocket science, right?
Yeah, that's really great advice, and also the match in personality as being kind of the
Critical.
number one thing, and that you can teach those practical skills or those activities of daily living support,
But you can't
tasks,
teach
but what you
attitude.
can't right, you can't teach
No,
compassion and attitude,
no.
and these are, relationships between people, so
Yeah.
I love that that's what you kind of learned in that
Yeah.
process.
And they change. They change over time. I also learned that, in the corporate world, they say hire slow and fire fast. Well, in the caregiving world, especially when you're dealing with your parents, you hire fast, trust your judgment, and you fire fast.
Mm.
So if there's something off, trust your gut, get rid of them. Next, you do not need to explain why.
So I wanna move to your book, which is about preparing for emergencies as a caregiver. What made you pick that topic to write a book about? I mean, there's so many different things that you could write about with caregiving. What led you there?
Well, the first book idea was I was going to rewrite the first aid book for elder care. And I thought, I started looking at first aid books, the Red Cross first aid book. And I thought, oh my God, I can't do this. This is like overwhelming. There's too much to do. And I'm not a doctor. But after some searching and figuring out what was the right place to start, I realized, oh, wait a second. If you've got an aging parent, even if you don't have any, if you have children, you are going to the emergency room at some point in the course of your life. So not that mom and dad are kids, but the frequency of calls to 911 to get the support is going to increase as your parents get older, or going there yourself with them. It's just that part of life. And we're not prepared how the differences between a child versus an adult and what that means. So that's sort of how it started, and it took a lot of research. It wasn't we just didn't, like, go out there and figure it out based on our own experience, but it was dealing with paramedics and trainers of paramedics and EMTs and first responders and firefighters and doctors, ER doctors and regular doctors and other clinicians and aides and caregivers and attorneys. We got everybody involved. So it was put together with a team of experts, not just moi.
Yeah, so what would you say are some common misconceptions about emergency situations for caregivers?
Misconceptions. Well, I would say maybe it's not a misconception, but it's more of and it's probably also not a fear, but it's waiting too long to call 911 when you think you need it. Don't hesitate. The first responders, the paramedics, and the EMTs are there for you. They're there to help you. They're there to help mom and dad. Even if, like, they've slid off the chair and they're too heavy for you to pick up, they may get lots of calls to, like, right size mom and dad and just put them back in a chair. But the other thing too is that you have to understand their job is to get you safely to an emergency room alive, and you can refuse to go. So if you just need somebody to get a little extra help because you can't physically pick somebody up and you don't have the equipment to do so, you can refuse transport. And that's important to know.
Do you have any take-home messages,
Yeah,
from
I
your
I would say
book?
if a parent is or when a parent is taken to the emergency room, if you can't physically be there with them, make sure you have somebody else to my dogs are going in the back, I'm sorry. It's it's
Hi, puppy.
it's a home office studio. But, yeah, pets are great for seniors as long as they don't jerk them off.
Mhm.
But, if you have a chance to actually go with them, or if you can't physically be there, get somebody that they know or a friend or a neighbor to be there with them because emergency rooms are scary situations. And I was just talking to a care facility nurse the other day, and she was mentioning the story of a gentleman who was taken off to the emergency room. And I said, "Well, did somebody go with him?" And they said, "No." I said, "Well, who was there with him in the emergency room?" I said, "Sadly, he's alone and nobody's there to answer the questions." Now we send him off with files and some medical information, but when there's a lot of activity in an emergency room and you may have somebody who has a cognitive impairment, that's a scary situation. Or even not have a cognitive impairment, who's answering the questions where they're confused or they can't answer, or they're cold and they need some help, or just being calmed down, or something else happens, like they have a stroke there or a heart attack, and nobody's there to even know that they're behind a closed curtain and an emergency is happening right then and there, even with all the beepers and everything else attached up. It's a wrong place to be left alone.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, everything got so complicated
Very
with
much so.
having family members with older adults who were in the emergency room,
We do not
and,
have that issue
I know.
now, but
Yeah.
when there is a way, you can I say never accept the answer, "No, you can't."
I know, I just found it so surprising, because for young children, obviously, they would allow a parent to come in emergency situations, and you would think it would be the same for an older adult, especially someone with dementia, but it was not the case,
Or
and,
somebody with a hearing impairment or a sight impairment
mhm.
or other physical conditions that they don't know anything about.